mothers, it is good to have you all with us. And happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. This is not a Mother's Day sermon, but thank you for everything you do. So years and years ago, back when I was in tech school for machining, the very first day of classes, the very first thing that the teacher started talking to us about was about dress. You know, some of the young guys, they'd come into class with jewelry on and baggy clothes. When I was that age, it was the chains on the jeans. Other kids came in wearing a tie and looking all spiffy. And the teacher told us none of that. No ties, no jewelry, no baggy clothes, no jeans with chains on them. Instead, you had to wear proper protective equipment. You had to wear safety glasses and hearing protection. We had to wear short sleeve Dickies work shirts with a work apron. And some of the guys, they got really upset. How dare you tell me how to dress? This is my style. So the teacher, he went through a safety briefing with slides of what can happen if loose clothing gets caught in industrial machinery, some of which is rather gruesome, and I'm not going to show you today. But if you have loose clothing or jewelry or ties, it can get caught in that machinery and suck you into the machine. Now, after he gave us that safety briefing, none of the young men complained about the dress standards. Sure, they might not have liked them. They might have wished for a different color or Dickies work shirt or whatever, but no one complained about the safety requirements because they didn't want something ripped off by a lathe. Now, I bring this up today because this is very similar to God's law. You know, God's law gives us lots and lots of restrictions. The Bible has lots of things that says, don't do this and instead do this other thing. And many people dislike those requirements. Many people will look at those requirements, those restrictions, and say, how dare God tell me what to do? How dare God restrict my fun? How dare God hold me back? But the thing about our God is he doesn't do anything just willy-nilly and off the cuff and for no reason at all. There's always a reason. And so today we're starting in on a new sermon series about strength through understanding God's restrictions. We can gain strength in our Christian walk by understanding why God puts the restrictions in place that he does. Now, to have this conversation, we're going to spend probably 5 sermons, maybe more, we'll see how it goes. And we're going to start by looking at 2 sermons on the Old Law. We'll then do 2 sermons on the New Covenant, and then finally we'll talk about some case studies towards the end of this series. And what we're going to see overall is that God makes his rules for our good. So today, we're going to have the first of our Old Covenant or Old Law sermons about their religious and civil law. Next week, we'll talk about their social and personal laws. Now, before we even get into the religious and civil laws today, we're going to talk about why we're even studying the Old Testament law in the first place. Why is it important for us to study Old Testament law? Then, we're going to look at the key idea, which is that these laws are for your good. Then finally, we'll talk about those religious and civil laws. Now, before we go any further, I have to put a good caveat out there. We are not under the Old Covenant anymore. We are not under the Old Law anymore. The laws we're talking about this week and next week, we are not required to follow. We are going to study them. We're going to talk about why they existed. But I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking that we need to follow the dietary restrictions of the Jews and all the other things we're going to talk about. There's some good lessons there, but we're not under those laws anymore. So with that being said, let's jump in and ask, why should we study the Old Testament law? Well, turn with me to Romans 15. Romans 15, verse 4, says, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope." Okay, what was written beforehand was written for our instructions. That's the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, the wisdom literature. was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So we study the Old Testament law so that we can better understand God. We want to understand our Master, and he gave those laws for a reason. So we study them to understand him better. Now take a look at Galatians 3. Galatians 3:24 through 25. Galatians 3:24 through 25 say, "Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor." So, that old law, part of its purpose was to lead us to Jesus, to lead us to Christ. So we study that old law so we can better understand the need for Christ. Now, a big part of this, we may not even understand the need for Jesus without that old law. You know, the New Testament talks about how he is the sacrificial lamb. Well, to us, a whole bunch of Gentiles who didn't grow up in the Jewish culture, what does that even mean? The New Testament will say, as it was written, he came to fulfill what was written. Well, what was written? Why do we need to know that? Well, so we need to go and study that Old Testament, the old law, so we can understand why he came. So that's why we're digging into the Old Testament law, to better understand God and to better understand the need for Jesus. Now let's talk about the key idea. And the key idea of this whole sermon series is for your good. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6, 20 through 25. As was read this morning, Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 20. "When your son asks you in time to come, saying, 'What do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean that the Lord our God commanded you?' Then you shall say to your son, 'We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he had sworn to our fathers.'" And then look at verse 24. "So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord for our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before the Lord our God, just as he commanded us." So what do we see here? We see that God's laws were first for their good. Now, that's kind of an interesting concept, right? You do something for someone's good, well, they may not necessarily like it at the moment, right? We feed our children vegetables for their good, even though they don't necessarily always like vegetables, right? You follow some of the laws of the land for your good, even if you don't necessarily like them. The laws are also for their survival. So it's not just for their good, but it's for their survival, so that they can be healthy and live in the land a long time. And as we study through some of these laws, some of them might have seemed to the people at that time really arbitrary. Like, why not eat pork? Well, now we know that pork has some really nasty stuff in it unless it's prepared correctly. It was for their survival. Interestingly enough, and I'll bring this up again next week some, the Jews were a lot healthier than all their neighbors, historically speaking, because of the health restrictions that God put on them. The laws were also there for their righteousness. This wasn't just about making them have a successful society. It was to make them holy, to show them God's standard of righteousness, which again is for their good, because they want to be right in the sight of God. Now turn forward a few chapters to Deuteronomy 10. Deuteronomy 10, 12 and 13 says something very similar. "Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you?" This is going to sound familiar. "But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today, for your good. Again, these commandments, these statutes, were for their good, to help them, for their benefit. Okay, so that's the overriding principle. The commands weren't given willy-nilly. The commands weren't given just arbitrarily, but they were given for their good. Well, now let's talk about how these laws were for their good. And we're going to start by talking about the religious laws. Now, we don't have time today to go through everything in great detail. We're not going to have the time to go through every law and explain all the details. So we're going to do an overview. We're going to look at some different categories of the old laws and talk about how they were for their good. Let's start by looking at laws for various offerings. Turn with me to Leviticus 1. And we'll do an overview of Leviticus 1 through 7. Starting in Leviticus 1, 1 through 5, we talk about burnt offerings. Then the Lord called to Moses, this is Leviticus 1:1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering an animal from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hands on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him and make atonement on his behalf. He shall slay the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around the altar. That is at the doorway of the tent of meeting." And it goes on and talks about some other details about that offering. But I want us to notice a couple things about this. So this is a pretty costly offering. You have an animal that's worth a lot to the people. And they bring that animal and they lay their hands on the head of it, figuratively transferring their guilt to the animal, and then the animal is killed. It's burned and various other things are done with the carcass. Goes on, and in chapter 2, we talk about grain offerings. Chapter 2, verse 1. "Now when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. And he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it." So right there, we already have some expensive things. Frankincense was not cheap. "He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, and shall take from it his handful of its fine flour and of its oil for all of its frankincense. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke as a memorial portion on the altar, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. And the remainder was going to be for Aaron and his sons for their food." Verse 4. "If they bring a grain offering that's baked in the oven, it shall be of unleavened cakes, fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers spread with oil." Later on in the chapter, verse 11, we learn there should be no leaven mixed in with any of these offerings. Verse 12 tells us that it needs to be from the first fruits of their harvest. And verse 14, we find out that if they're going to give grain that hasn't been ground, its whole kernels, it needs to be roasted. So God gave them some very exacting standards for these burnt offerings and these grain offerings. But then, in the next few chapters, we learn about how to use those offerings. So those are the offerings they were to make, but then the times they were to make them. Chapter 3, we learn about peace offerings. 3:1. "Now if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he is going to offer out of the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without defect before the Lord. He shall lay his hands on the head of his offering and slay it at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around the altar." And it goes on and talks more about this. But a peace offering. So to bring peace between them and God. Chapter 4, we learn about sin offerings. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally." Now, isn't that interesting? Let's pause right there. Someone sins unintentionally. You ever done that? I think we've all done that, right? Okay, so someone sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and commits any of them. If the anointed priest sins so as to bring guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord a bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. So you do something unintentionally. You're not intending to go sin, but you realize, I messed up. Well, you go and you get yourself an animal, as was prescribed in the previous chapters, and you take it to the tabernacle or the temple, and you make that offering. Going on to verse 13 talks about if the entire congregation sins. Now, if the whole congregation of Israel, that is the entire nation, commits error and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, that's got to be an interesting situation, right? The whole nation sins, and they commit any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and they become guilty. Look at verse 14. When the sin which they committed becomes known, then the assembly shall offer a bull of the herd for a sin offering and bring it before the tent of meeting. So the entire nation sins, and it's brought to their attention probably by a prophet, which, as we study the Old Testament, we see happening quite a few times, where a prophet will say, hey, all of y'all sinned. You have to make an offering. Verse 22 talks about if a leader sins. Chapter 4, verse 22. I am in the wrong chapter. That's why I was looking at my page flipped. It's like, that is not right. There we go. 4:22. When a leader sins and unintentionally does any one of the things which the Lord his God has commanded not to be done, and he becomes guilty, if his sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring for his offering a goat, a male without defect. And it goes on and talks about that. So a leader, Moses or Aaron or one of the elders of the nation or one of the judges, sins, and it's made known to him. They're not above the law. They're not above the requirements. They had to make an offering. And then verse 27 talks about a common person. Verse 27, now if any of the common people sins unintentionally in doing any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done and becomes guilty, if his sin which he has committed is made known to him, then he shall bring for his offering a goat, a female without defect, for his sin which he has committed. So these are all unintentional sins. But what about someone who sins intentionally? Well, chapter 5 and 6 talk about guilt offerings. Chapter 5:1. Now, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify when he is a witness, whether he is seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt. Or if a person touches any unclean thing, whether a carcass or an unclean beast, or the carcass of an unclean cattle, or a carcass of an unclean swarming thing, then it is, though it is hidden from him and he is unclean, then he will be guilty. If he touches human uncleanness of whatever sort his uncleanness may be, with which he becomes unclean, and is hidden from him, and it becomes known to him, he will be guilty. Or if a person swears thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, in whatever matter a man may speak thoughtlessly with an oath, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it, he will be guilty of one of these. So it shall be when he becomes guilty in one of these things that he shall confess that which he has sinned. And it goes on and talks about bringing the offering. Chapter 6, beginning of chapter 6, we read, when a person sins or acts unfaithfully against the Lord and deceives his companion in regard to a deposit or a security entrusted to him, or through robbery, or if he has extorted from his companions, or has found what was lost and lied about it and sworn falsely, so he sins in regard to any one of the things that a man may do, then it shall be when his sin becomes guilty, that he shall restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by extortion, or the deposit which was entrusted to him, or the lost thing which he found, or anything about which he swore falsely. He shall make restitution for it in full and add to it 1/5 more. He shall give it to one to whom it belongs on the day he presents his guilt offering. And it goes on and talks more about that. So we see offerings for if somebody sins that's not an unintentional sin. Okay, lots of details, right? And we're all sitting here thinking, why did David just read all these things? Well, how are these things for your good? These laws that we just read through, how are they for their good? Well, they demonstrate the consequences for sin. They demonstrate that sin has repercussions. Remember what Romans 6:23 says. Romans 6:23 says, the wages of sin is death. But if God struck us down the first time we sinned, boom, you're dead. No one will be able to learn their lessons, right? So God gave this set of laws to show that sin causes death. It should be your death. But he gave them a way for it to be the death of something else. Okay, so that's the sacrifices. Let's now talk about laws for the priest. We're not going to go through these in as great a detail as we did the sacrifices. But Leviticus 8 through 10 and Leviticus 21 through 22. And there are laws about washings, how they had to wash in a certain way before they came to serve at the temple. They had to wear ceremonial clothes. It wasn't just normal tunics. They had holy undergarments and holy tunics and all these accoutrements they had to wear. There was anointing with special oils in specific ways. There were specific sacrifices that they had to make before they could serve as a priest. There were health standards they had to live up to. They couldn't serve if they had any number of different ailments. If they were sick, if they had open sores, they couldn't serve as priests. They also had special food because since they were serving at the temple, they didn't have time to go out and farm fields and raise flocks. And so part of the sacrifices were to support them. Now, how were these regulations for the priests for their good? Well, they show the importance of being holy before God. And you think about that for us today. You know, we don't have all those same regulations. But does God care how we present ourselves to him? Well, historically speaking, yes. We then talk about, in Leviticus 16 and 17, laws for the yearly atonement. Now this one, we studied through in greater detail when I did my sermon on Old Testament ritual washings. But in this, there is that yearly sacrifice. See, the tabernacle and then the temple had a most holy place that no one could enter into except one time a year, and that was only the high priest when he came with very specific sacrifices. And so there were certain sacrifices that had to be made, which included a perfect white lamb with no blemishes. There were particular washings. In fact, as we study through this, the high priest ends up washing somewhere around 3 times. And then there's this scapegoat that they would let go out into the wilderness. And then once all these things had been done, the high priest could enter the holy place. And he would take the blood from that sacrifice and he would sprinkle it on the mercy seat. And as Dan has pointed out, in there we have 3 different words for the use of the liquid. There's dipping his thumb, immersing his thumb, there's sprinkling, and then there's pouring of the blood. Now, how were these things for their good? Well, of course, it was going to make atonement for the people, as God commanded. But for us today, they foreshadow the sacrifice of the Messiah. Jesus is spoken of as that sacrificial lamb. What does that even mean if we didn't have that Old Testament lesson? He was without blemish. His blood was shed, though he was innocent. That foreshadows that sacrifice that Jesus made for us. There's also laws for various religious festivals and the sanctuary, Leviticus 23 through 24. And we learned there about the Sabbath, the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and various regulations for the sanctuary. And as you read through these, they're absolutely fascinating because it wasn't just like, hey, have a big party. There was very specific things they had to do as they went through these different festivals, remembering very specific events that happened in their history. But okay, all these festivals, how are they for your good? Well, they show how exacting God is about how he is worshipped. He cared very deeply about exactly how he was worshipped. Now, that's a good lesson for us today. We can't just do anything we want and say that we're worshiping God with it. He gives very specific standards, and he's very exacting about how he is worshipped. Okay, so we've talked some about religious laws and how they were for their good. Now let's talk about the civil laws, and this is kind of something that is really kind of interesting. A lot of times people look at the Old Testament and they'll think it's all about religion, that all of the old law was just religious ordinances. But this wasn't just laws for how to worship God. He was giving them the laws for their entire society. How when they got into the Promised Land, they were supposed to have a functioning law system and social code. So we're going to turn to Deuteronomy 17 and look at some of the laws for the administration of justice. Deuteronomy 17. And we're going to start in verse 2. Deuteronomy 17, verse 2. If there is found in your midst, in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God by transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly hosts which I have not commanded, and if it is told to you and you have heard it, then you shall inquire thoroughly. Behold, if it is true and the thing certain that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then you shall bring out that man or that woman who has done this evil deed in your gates, that is, the man or the woman, and you shall stone them to death. Now, a lot of times modern day people look at the stoning and they go, oh, that's barbaric. But you notice before the stoning, there is due process, that you are to examine the matter thoroughly. And if it's true and the thing is certain, you're not just supposed to execute someone willy-nilly, but it is to be thoroughly investigated. And the next verse tells us that there needs to be 2 or 3 witnesses. Verse 6, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. That sets up the requirement for it to not be hearsay. There needs to be enough witnesses to make the matter sure. But sometimes there's matters that come up that you can't necessarily deal with at the gates of the city. So there is put forth the necessity of a higher court. Verse 8, if any case is too difficult for you to decide between one kind of homicide or another, between one kind of lawsuit or another, and between one kind of assault or another, being a case of dispute in your courts, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. So you shall come to the Levitical priest or the judge who is in office in those days, and you shall inquire of them, and they will declare to you the verdict in the case. So your elders can't decide the matter at the gates of the city. Well, you go to the higher court. You go to the Levites, or you go to the judge who's in office, and they'll decide the matter. That makes a really big safety net for local corruption. If there is local corruption, you can appeal to a higher court who overrule the local. We also see some interesting laws concerning future kings. Look over at verses 15 and following. We'll back up to verse 14. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like the nations who are around me. God didn't want them to do that, but we see in Samuel that's exactly what they did. We want to be like the nations around us. Give us a king. Verse 15. You shall surely set a king over you who the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver or gold for himself. Now it shall come when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by carefully observing all the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from his countrymen to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. Now, think about for a second all the kings of Israel, starting with Saul. They all broke laws. They all had multiple wives. That's why Solomon went into idolatry, because he had a multitude of women, the foreign women that he loved. If they had followed that law, they wouldn't have had those problems. So how are these for your good? Well, they ensure that justice is properly carried out. And you go through those laws and you think about the problems that Israel had through their history. Most of the problems Israel had was because they didn't follow something put down in that section right there. But that's not where the civil laws ended. There were also laws about the cities of refuge. Deuteronomy 19 talks about this, how if there's an accidental death, you're in the field, you're working with someone, and the head of your axe breaks off and strikes your neighbor and he dies. Well, you might be accused to be a murderer, and their next of kin might come and try to kill you, so you can flee to a city of refuge. And when you're at that city of refuge, you have sanctuary until the matter is fully investigated and a decision has been passed down. And then, well, if you're guilty, you're stoned. If you're innocent, you get to go free. So how would the cities of refuge be for your good? Well, they ensure that those who are innocent can receive due process. And that's an important aspect of justice, that if someone's innocent, they're not executed before their court case has been heard. Now, Deuteronomy 20 puts forth some laws for warfare. And this section in particular is unique among the Middle Eastern countries, Middle Eastern nations of that time. To my knowledge, none of them had a code for warfare like this. And when you look at history, some of the atrocities done by the nations surrounding Israel they'll turn your stomach. It's awful. But let's look at Deuteronomy 20. The beginning of it says, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted, do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them, for the Lord your God is one who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies to save you. So they're supposed to trust in God first and foremost. Trust in God that he'll give you the battle. We then see some exemptions for military service. Verse 5, the officers shall also speak to the people, saying, Who is the man that has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would dedicate it. Who is the man who has planted a vineyard and has not begun to use of its fruits? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would begin to use its fruits. And who is the man who is engaged to a woman and has not married her? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would marry her. Those are some pretty broad exemptions from military service. You built a new house. You plant a new vineyard. Okay, let's talk about the vineyard for a second. How long does it take a vineyard to grow to fruition? It doesn't just take a year. It may take a decade or more before you start getting fruit from it. Well, you have this exemption from military service. Or if you're engaged and you haven't married your wife, well, go home. Again, that's very unique among, history in general. There's also a law saying they need to prefer peaceful resolutions. That if they go against a city, that they should offer the opportunity for surrender. And if they surrender, there's some more laws about how to handle that. If they don't surrender, then kill them. But there's also rules for non-combatants, that they were to kill the soldiers, but not the elderly, the women, or the children. Now, the exemption from that was when they were conquering Canaan, God told them certain cities to kill all the men, women, children, and animals. We also see the treatment of the land during war. They weren't supposed to cut down fruit-bearing trees, but they were to leave those. They weren't supposed to destroy cropland. They were supposed to preserve it because God wanted the land usable. So again, how are these for your good? Well, they minimize wartime atrocities and promote peaceful resolutions. God didn't want his people to be like Alexander the Great, conquering the whole known world. He wanted them to possess the land he gave them and then live in relative peace with their neighbors as long as it relied on them. And again, if they had followed these laws, their history would be significantly different than it actually was. And as a side note, this is one of those proofs of God's word, because God put forth all these laws, and then immediately his people started breaking them. It doesn't record history different than the way it happened. It didn't say, hey, they all did everything perfect. Immediately we start seeing their mistakes, proving the need for that Messiah, because they couldn't even keep their own civil law, much less their religious law. So we've been talking about the Jewish law, the religious and civil laws. And what we've seen as we've talked about why we're studying this and the overall reason for it is that God never gives arbitrary rules. There's always a reason for the rules that he gives. Now, that's going to become really important when we get into the New Testament in a couple of weeks. But by way of application for today, as we're closing out our sermon time, I encourage you, study God's word to understand God. Now, that may seem like a somewhat obvious statement. Yeah, of course we do that. But let's think about this for a second. There's a temptation to study to prove ourselves right. There's a temptation to study to prove someone else wrong. And there may be a temptation to study, well, just kind of to prove, my group's beliefs. But we need to study to understand God. Because as we're understanding God, not just understanding the do's and don'ts of what he said, but understanding who he is and the reasons for the commands he has given, then following those commands becomes much easier because we know why they exist. Now today, as we close out our sermon time, this hasn't really been a convict you or step on your toes kind of sermon. But if you have a need, if there's some prayer that you need from the congregation, or if you want to become a Christian or learn more about how to become a Christian, we want to be here for you. So when we sing our invitation song, I encourage you to come up to the front. One of the elders will come speak with you. So if you have a need, whatever it may be, please let it be known as we stand and we